Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, my name's Rob Ellis. I'm a research fellow based at the University of Exeter. And my background's an ecological physiologist. So I'm interested in how organisms adapt to changing environmental conditions and how we can use that understanding to predict climate change impacts. And another line of research, how we can optimise aquaculture productivity to meet food demands in the coming century. And I'm going to pose to you a question: does sex really matter for this and for understanding these different responses in a wide range of organisms? And really, to understand this, we really need to define what sex is and understand how it's determined in a wide range of biological systems. Taking a human point of view, first of all, how do we define sex? Well, sex is the biological phenotype of an individual, whether it has male or female reproductive organs or male and female gametes. And this is quite distinct from gender, which is a socially constructed personal identity, how you see yourself in society. And this is based on your internal psychological experience in society. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fundamental biological differences between organisms based on the presence or absence of different sexual organs and sexual gametes. So again, coming back to the human context, does sex matter? Well, this has been quite widely debated, and even this morning's talks would suggest there's a little bit of debate around this topic still. But it wasn't until 1985 that the National Institutes of Health mandated that we included women in clinical trials and tested males and females differently. So before that, it was perceived that there were no sex-based differences beyond that of the reproductive system. Subsequently, as a number of the talks this morning have shown, there are actually fundamental biological differences between males and females at a cellular level and at a physiological and immunological level, which can impact health and organism responses. But that's in a human system, so what about the wider biological picture? And again, we need to really define how sex is defined within a system. So I'm sure, as we've been introduced this morning, we're all aware that sex is determined in humans genetically by the presence of specific sex chromosomes. So where the sex chromosome is heterozygous, where you've got an XY, you'll result in masculinization and the resulting embryo will be a boy, and where it's homozygous, you'll result in a female. Now, as biologists and society, we're kind of habituated to assume that sexual determination, or genetic sexual determination, is kind of the status quo and is the norm. And we're also perceived that sex is determined at fertilization and then it's fixed throughout the life cycle. So you're either a male or a female, or in a very rare case, you can be intersex. But this is an exception particularly. And obviously, other modes of sexual determination are often seen as aberrant or strange. Now, whilst this is true, sexual determination is present in a number of different groups: mammals, birds, snakes, some lizards and fish. It's certainly not the norm. And indeed, given the numbers of organisms that employ these different strategies, this is actually in the minority. And I'm going to demonstrate different sexual modes and reproductive processes, and then in terms of determination throughout the animal kingdom. I'm focusing particularly on aquatic organisms, looking at sex in the sea. Now, marine organisms have the widest range of reproductive modes on the planet. And this takes a number of different forms, the first of which is the basic method of reproduction, how you produce progeny to continue the next generation. And this can either be through asexual or sexual reproduction. Now, asexual reproduction is the generation of progeny, so the next generation, but it's through clonal mechanisms. So the new individual is a clone of the parent itself, and therefore there's no change in genetic diversity. Conversely, sexual reproduction is where you're mixing gametes and you're getting a crossing through meiosis and a fusion, and therefore you increase genetic diversity in the population. And this is really important for looking at adaptation of populations. And clearly here, there's a clear definition on sex. In the asexual situation, there are no separate sexes. It's just asexual with clonal. Now, some organisms can employ solely sexual reproduction. Some organisms can employ asexual and sexual in different levels, depending on the environments in which they're exposed to. So obviously understanding these different processes is key to understanding whether sex is important. Marine organisms also employ a different level of energetic investment in reproduction. Now, this can be analogous to humans, where you'll have internal fertilization and then very highly invested parental care, up until the juvenile is able to look after itself. Now, this is a specific strategy looked at developing a small number of individuals of juveniles and then rearing them up to be able to cope in the environment. This has very high energetic costs associated with that one individual, but increases the chance of survival of that individual significantly. Conversely, many organisms employ a broadcast spawning approach. This is where you produce many millions of eggs or sperm where they're released into the water column freely. There they fertilise, and then the individual gametes or juveniles are then left in the water column to fend for themselves. Now this strategy is looking at where you invest very little energetically in terms of each individual gamete, but you produce millions and millions of them with the hope that some will survive to adulthood. And they're very clearly different strategies with respect to energy invested, and therefore energy you have for other physiological processes and to cope with stress. And clearly males and females have a very different role and different energetic requirements based on these different reproductive modes. Now the final thing to consider is obviously in humans we're dioecious. This means we're a single sex throughout our life, which is determined at fertilisation. This is not the case in marine organisms solely, particularly. There are definitely examples of gonochoristic dioecious individuals which are entirely male or female for their whole life. However, this is a complete scale that goes right up to hermaphroditic organisms, where a single individual will contain both male and female sexual organs in the same individual. Moreover, to confuse this slightly more, this can take two forms. It can either be simultaneous, so male and female sex organs are present in that individual at the same time, or it can be sequential. So focusing first on this, on the sea hairs on the top left of the screen, or top right for you, there's a sea hair mating chain. So these are all hermaphrodites that are simultaneous. They all contain both male and female reproductive organs. So the individual at the back of the chain is acting here solely as a male, passing on male gametes to the individual in front. And the female, or the individual at the very front, is acting as a female, receiving male gametes. The two individuals in the middle will be acting as functional males and females. They'll receive sperm from the individual behind them and pass on their sperm to the individual in front. And that's how they reproduce. So they're actively acting as both males and females simultaneously throughout their life cycle. Another clear example is this sequential hermaphroditism. And if anyone watched Blue Planet 2, you'll probably recognise this individual. It's an Asian sheep's head wrasse. And it was in the first episode. And what we saw in the BBC's great documentary was this fish was a group of large females and one dominant male. But then through the programme, one of the largest females then changed sex to become a male and to challenge to have that harem. The idea being that one male could then pass its genes on. So being the dominant male in this society, as it were, is much more beneficial in terms of passing on your genetic information to the next generation. But in terms of understanding whether sex has an implication, you really need to understand different processes and how we define sex in a marine environment. Now that's how we define sex and what sex is, but how is it determined? Well, again, in humans it's determined genetically, and it's we're predisposed to think of it in that way. But to demonstrate how diverse this can be, I'm going to use the analogy of the fish. So there's around 30,000 species of fish. So this is about 50% of all described vertebrate species, of which there's 64,000. So that's around half. And they're extremely successful, having colonised nearly all aquatic habitats. They go for the deep ocean up to mountain lakes. They can go from hypersaline through to very fresh water. They can go to the very acidic Amazon through to very basic waters. And they can take temperature extremes from the polar oceans through to like thermal springs. And they've got equally diverse adaptations to cope with these different environments. One of which is how they differentiate between becoming male and female. And this is on a kind of there's three processes at play here, and these vary in terms of their influence on the different organism. Predominantly, we're aware of major genetic factors. This is sexual determination, and in humans through sex chromosomes. But this can also be minor genetic factors, such as epigenetics or influence of the parent, and then finally environmental factors. So the environmental factors that can completely determine whether an individual becomes a male or a female. And unsurprisingly, of all the fish species that have been investigated to date, they fall on this scheme somewhere. For tilapia, for example, are probably the most diverse in this sense, in that they have a number of these different factors co-integrating and impacting to influence whether the individual turns out to be a male or a female. But specifically focusing on environmental sex determination for a second, these two can be very different. For example, in eels, density can impact whether you become a male or a female. So the more dense a population, the more males. The idea being here, males can produce very many more larvae for less energetic investment. In terms of sperm is less costly to produce than eggs. So therefore, you're increasing your chances of balancing that sex ratio. Zebrafish, however, if you increase the growth rate, you have more females. But if the oxygen decreases, you get more males. Japanese flounder, here there's a temperature difference. So if it's cold, you're more likely to be male, or if it's hot, you're more likely to be male. If it's in the middle, it's a balanced sex ratio. So there's some really fundamental differences here in terms of your environment in which you grow up in as to whether you develop as a male or a female. And that can obviously have an impact on how you respond to environmental parameters. And a really key example I want to demonstrate here is this of the clownfish. So we all know the clownfish from Finding Nemo. Well, they have really interesting social hierarchies where you have a family living around a single anemone, and you'll have juveniles, a number of small males, and then a single large dominant female who's very protective, and her role is to protect the family. And as you can see here is a video from a colleague, Susan Mills. They're very territorial. So here's one protecting her nest and biting a shark, which you wouldn't think would be a particularly wise strategy. But this is their role, and they're very aggressive, and they defend their brood. But interestingly, if you remove that dominant female from the group, the next largest male becomes a female. So I'm sorry, Disney, you got this one wrong. So when Nemo's mum was taken away by the barracuda, in actual fact, Nemo's dad would have become his mum, and then the family would have continued in that order. So slightly different story, admittedly, but it shows you that actually sex determination is completely different, and we need to consider these things in different biological systems. Okay, so coming into climate change. So we know that sex differs in different marine organisms, and we need to really think about how that can impact the organism. So how does climate change come into it? Well, humans have been producing CO2 at an extortionate rate since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And just this year, we actually exceeded 400 parts per million for the first time on record. And the last record goes back 800,000 years. And looking at modelling, it's been proposed that this is probably the highest it's been for around 30 million years. What's more, with continued emissions, it's projected that actually levels are going to approach around 1,000 microatmospheres or 1,000 ppm in the atmosphere coming towards the end of the century. Now, we've all heard of global warming. This is causing the planet to warm up. And this could have significant knock-on impacts for the organisms living across the planet. Equally, it could result in two other fundamental changes. Changing the chemistry of the oceans through a process called ocean acidification, where the seawater pH is reducing due to the CO2 increasing in the atmosphere, and also the oxygen in the oceans is reducing. And my research really looks at how these two processes, or these three processes kind of intertwined, impact organisms, and how we can interpret responses to project future change and best mitigate any possible impacts. And therefore, understanding sex could be fundamental for interpreting these results. So what do we know to date? Well, there's very little research, surprisingly. There's been studies that have demonstrated differential mortality between males and females exposed to high PCO2, or ocean acidification, where females had a higher mortality than males. Research I undertook recently looked at mussels, and we showed that more than just the fundamental mortality, it impacts their energy metabolism differently. So in exposing mussels to different environmental stresses, we found that actually males and females respond to climate change stresses differently in terms of their basic energy metabolism at a cellular level, with males being more susceptible to temperature and to bacterial exposure, whereas females are more susceptible to pH. And interestingly, other research has demonstrated in terms of an energetic level, again, a female that is just spent, so has released all her gametes, is more physiologically close to a male than it is to a ripe female. So again, in terms of understanding energetic investment in these processes, we really need to start looking at the different elements of reproduction and sexual differentiation. And finally, just these last couple of weeks, the first study to be published in terms of sexual differentiation in an invertebrate with respect to climate change, and has shown that as the seawater pH reduces and becomes more acidic, we're going to have more female oysters. So again, does this matter? And it's something I'll come on to in a minute. But this kind of got me thinking a little bit more widely. If we've been showing some level of impacts, how wide are these? So with a group of colleagues, we undertook the intention was a meta-analysis to look at all the studies published in ocean acidification between 2008 and 2016, two key points in ocean acidification researchers' seminal meetings that took place. And we appraised 4,000 papers that have looked at this topic and categorised particularly 500 primary literature studies looking at biological responses to ocean acidification in 4 key groups. Each one was categorised based on looking for 7 terms to define organism sex, and then categorising the way that they appraised for sex in 5 different ways. One was not mentioned at all. One was mentioned but not accounted for. You had accounted for but not tested, tested but not tested statistically, and then finally statistically analysed. And looking at the data here, kind of the take-home message is just 3.7% of studies tested for sex-based differences in climate change responses. Now, does that matter? Well, it's quite surprising. Obviously, there could be a large body of research that we're missing in terms of sex-based differences. As we saw in the last talk, males and females respond very differently. So what could be leading to this difference and this sex bias or lack of sex appreciation? Well, there's barriers to inclusion in sex. I suppose the first of this is the assumption that sex doesn't matter beyond reproduction. So scientists aren't traditionally inclined to test for sex-based differences. And whether that's right or wrong is a matter of quite a strong debate. The second is, in actual fact, beyond a mammalian system, sex is actually quite difficult to determine in many marine organisms non-invasively. The example here I give of a crab is quite clear. You've got the telson here. This is a male, which is kind of more of a triangular telson, and the female, it's rounder. So that's very easy to look at. So there's sexual dimorphism here that's very easy to appreciate. In many organisms, this isn't the case. There's no way of testing for a sex of an organism non-invasively before you undertake an experiment, which obviously then confounds your experiment if you've tested it prior. So it's actually very difficult to do this, and this becomes even more difficult when we're looking at early life stages. So in an adult crab, it's very easy to see. This is a crab zooia, and it's impossible. So how can we test differences between males and females at these early life cycle stages if it's impossible to test between males and females, and does it matter again? Well, of course, when we need to understand if it really matters, it's looking at what the average response we're trying to appreciate. If we fail to account for males and females, we create what's the average phenotype. So you're looking at an average pool response. And you assume that individual's response is representative of the entire population. But as you can see from the kind of the research that we did with the metabolome, you found males and females segregate very differently. So if you were to actually test these two pools of individuals, or two sexes very differently, you'd actually find two contrasting responses that are binary in this case. But if you pooled those as a single population of mussels, you wouldn't actually find a climate change response. So it can really change how we interpret this, and we need to be very careful. So population level effects of environmental sex determination. Probably one of the most kind of well-known is that of turtles, in terms of how the incubation temperature in the nest influences if they become male or female. Low temperatures, they become males. High temperatures, they become females. And we've known this for many years. But is this likely to have an implication at a kind of a climate change level? And I bring you to one key example, which is the dinosaurs. And it's been proposed back in around 2004 that it might be that temperature sex determination may have had a role to play in the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Due to the fact as the asteroid impacted on the Earth and kicked up an ash cloud, the temperature increased, and this is well known. And it's been proposed that the fact that many of the dinosaurs have temperature sex determination resulted in a lack of daughters, and thus the populations will move towards extinction due to the fact that there was fewer and fewer females in the populations. This is still a theory. It's very difficult to test, obviously, but it's an intriguing one and something we should really be considering with respect to climate change responses. So in summary, sex in the ocean is complex, it's diverse, and it's in some cases environmentally determined, and we need to be considering this. It impacts physiology, behaviour, reproduction, and there can be population-level effects. And yet only 4% of the studies to date have appreciated it, or at least tested for it. So there could be a large body of research that we're missing that helps us understand variability between climate change responses. I'm not saying sex is definitely going to affect everything, but as we looked at in the last talk, we should really be thinking of sex as a biological variable of interest that we really need to either rule in or out when we're looking at importance. And finally, failure to do so may mean that we're misinterpreting climate change responses. And the take-home message really is climate change scientists should think more about sex. So thank you very much.